Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's stream with the title Snapshots from the Road to French. This is the second part in a series about regular sound changes on their road of development from the earliest proto-language that we know towards the language that exists today. And today it is French. You might notice here in the title slide that I have broken it up from as first the road from Indo-European to Romance and then from Romance to French. This is because the development of French was slightly different than that of English, but we will get back to that later. Let's begin with a map. I have decided to just draw these kinds of maps. They are useful, they are fun, they might not be entirely scientifically founded, but this is not a conference talk. Being able to say exactly what I want to say is exactly why we are doing this as a VTuber exercise. So, we have the homeland of the Proto-Indo-Europeans in eastern Ukraine, most likely migration westwards along the northern European plain, that from which the Balto-Slavic languages and the Germanic languages split, and which ends with the Italo-Celtic languages here in current southern Germany and central to southern Italy. And the same as a tree model. Here this part with Northwest Indo-European, Southern and Aryan as their own main branches is the view that I subscribe to, but which is not clearly correct. I will show it anyway. Then getting into developments on the Italo-Celtic level. So this is where the languages that would develop into such as Irish, Gaelic and Welsh, and on the other side Italian and Spanish, split off from Proto-Indo-European before they split from each other. And this layer or stage of development has relatively few changes, so it might be that this phase did not last particularly long. However, it most likely lasted longer than the possible stage that contained the Italo-Celtic and Germanic, or even the one that might have contained the Italo-Celtic, Germanic and Balto-Slavic languages. The main change here is from P, P, a vowel, and Qu to Qu, vowel, Qu. This is a change that might first appear quite unexpected, as P and Qu are not quite similar to each other, but when you break it down to the components, it makes some amount of sense. The P here is labial stop, so this is a stop consonant that is made with the lips, and the Qu has a velar stop, the K, and it has a labial secondary articulation, the W. So when you go from P to Qu, you retain both of these attributes, but you break them up into two articulations. So it is less surprising than it appears. Here's an example word of this. This is 5. In Proto-Indo-European was penque, and the P survives, for example, in Greek, pente. This is where you get words such as pentagram, pentagon, that kind of thing. And in Italo-Celtic, this developed into quenque. So both of these become the same. But interestingly enough, both the Italic languages and the Celtic languages have a split into so-called P and Q branches. And these are groups where the Qu cluster developed in a different way. The Q branches, such as Latin and Irish, are the ones where where the velar nature of this cluster remained. In Latin, we have fairly little change. This one is 4. Quetuares in Italo-Celtic, cum quattuor in Latin, fairly little change, and Geophys in Old Irish. This has changed more than the Latin one. Of course, it is also attested much later. But in contrast to this, we have the P branches. The Oscan language was one of the P Italic languages, and here quattuor in Latin is petior. So, in this case, the opposite of the previous process has happened after the first process. And in this case, it not only reverses the first process, but it also changes the original quers into pes. So 5 in Oscan would be something like pempe. And then a P-Celtic example, Brythonic. This is the ancient Celtic language of the island of Great Britain. So this is an ancestral form of Welsh, for example. Number 4 was Pedvar, so quite similar to Petior. Then, getting into the Italic languages. Here we have the breakup of Italo-Celtic into Italic languages, Celtic languages, and possibly some others, which you will be better able to understand with this map. So here in the Alps, we have the core area of the Celtic languages, then central and southern Italy, the core area of the Italic languages, and in antiquity there were some languages that might have been either of these or might have been another major branch of the Italo-Celtic languages. These contain, for example, the Venetic language, which was spoken in antiquity close by to an area where Celtic had already spread into the Po River Valley. But whether Venetic was a kind of Celtic or kind of Italic, or neither really, is unfortunately not known. When it comes to ancient languages, many of them, particularly the ones that were eliminated in antiquity, just did not leave enough of a trace that we could say something clear about them. This is also a problem with some of the other languages of the area. There are some languages in Spain that might have been Italo-Celtic, we just don't know. The Sic here in Sicily is Sikel, perhaps Sicel in English. This was a minority language of the interior of Sicily, as in antiquity the coasts of Sicily had been conquered and assimilated by the Greeks coming in from the east. This is also why I have some non-white area here in southern Italy. The southernmost coasts of Italy were also colonized by Greeks. Comments. Hello Shinhylus. How come Celtic is closer to Italic than Germanic? How come? This is a difficult question to answer. Because it developed like that. It likely split together from the language form that became Germanic, together with Italic, and only later split from that language. If the question is how do we know, then it's because of the previous slides. They are both phonological, so this penque to quenque development that only happens for the Celtic and Italic languages, and there are some grammatical developments that also only occur in the Celtic and Italic languages. Grammatical history is actually something that I would love to get into. It might be a little bit more difficult to approach than phonological history, but at some point I will run out of languages that I feel comfortable making these snapshots about. And at that point, I imagine we'll have to get into the grammar histories of these languages. Then, hello Velek, greetings. I found that interesting because modern Irish in terms of grammatical structure is quite close to modern German. This is not surprising because both of the grammars of both of these languages have been simplified in a very fundamental way. For example, the Proto-Germanic language that I am more familiar with than Proto-Celtic only retained 2 of the original 3 time forms of Proto-Indo-European. And some of these have, of course, developed further. The Germanic languages generally have more so-called periphrastic time forms. So I have done, I had done, I will do. So periphrastic literally means phrased around, and practically it means that there's an extra auxiliary verb being used to produce this kind of verb forms. In contrast, for example, Italian and I think all of the Romance languages have an inflectional future. So instead of saying I will do with this auxiliary verb will, an Italian would say facerò, where the rò at the end signifies that this is the future. This is also another topic that I would be very interested in tackling, particularly when it comes to the Germanic languages. If we get to that point, I'd have to do some actual research to tackle the grammatical history of Irish. I'm thinking of doing snapshots on Irish. Let's see how it goes. I'm not very familiar with it, but I think I will be able to make phonological history with a little bit less effort, because phonological history is a topic that I am more familiar with than grammatical history. So, then getting into the actual Italic developments. These are actually fairly weak again. So it might be that the Italic languages themselves are a group that remained united only for an extremely short time. What happens here is that the breakdown of the aspirated stops in Indo-European begins. If you watch the episode for English, you might remember the Grimm's Law, a table of various sounds that develop into each other. The left column in this table were the voiced aspirated stops. So this is like b, d, g, and g, g, g. The aspirated labialized stop is something that I am almost incapable of producing. These are the ones that disappeared in almost all Indo-European languages. Sanskrit retained these, but I do not know if the modern North Indian languages retain them. This is another topic that I am not familiar with. You might remember that in the Germanic languages, this simply lost the aspiration, so b became b, and eventually in the chain, the p became f. In the case of the Italic languages, you could think of it that way, that the leftmost column jumps straight into the rightmost column. So you eventually end up with f as the reflex for b. But this is only the case in Latin. In the Italic languages in general, these first turned into voiced fricatives. So fricatives are the kind of sounds that you make when your airflow becomes turbulent, but you do not completely obstruct the airflow in the mouth. So, for example, an unvoiced labial fricative is f and f, and the voiced one is the same, except you make your voice box vibrate. So f, v, and then v, this letter here, and the. Both of these are present in English, so most listeners should be at least vaguely familiar with them. The g becomes a h. Again, I'm not familiar with these sounds. I have to make them. I have to arrive at them through another step. In this case, the non-voiced fricatives, because I am familiar with those. And then something like that. That's again extremely difficult. But all of these break down differently in the various Italic languages. This is, of course, not a snapshot on the road to Oscan, as Oscan has disappeared in antiquity. So we will only be tackling the way that these developed in Latin. Another comment. I am extremely excited for that. Thank you. I hope you will find the presentation interesting once it comes out. In a few weeks, I think. Perhaps 6 weeks. My plan is to have a linguistics episode each Sunday and alternate between snapshots and general information topics. And the next snapshots would likely be High German and Spanish, as these are languages that I am familiar with, and then Irish after that. Possibly Russian after that. We'll have to see how confident I feel about talking about Russian. I speak some Russian, but I am not an expert on its history. So here we have the tray for Latin. Here we have, within the Italic, we have two main branches, the Latino-Faliscan languages. So Faliscan is a language very similar to Latin. And then the Osco-Umbrian languages that are further apart from Latin. You might remember Oscan was the one where quinque, from it, the Latin for 5, they developed into Pempe. And as a map, the Falisco-Latin, in this case, because the Faliscans lived north of Rome, were actually geographically a very small language area in pre-classical antiquity. And most of Italic Italy was taken by the Osco-Umbrian languages. The more northern areas here in Tuscany and some areas in Rhaetia were occupied by Tyrrhenian languages such as Etruscan, the large high culture of Tuscany. And then the Celtic languages had spread into northern Italy by the point where we have textual information. It appears that the native languages of the Italian islands outside of Sicily were not Italic. Of course, they have since been Romanized. Here we see that it is not necessarily the language that ends up winning in history is not necessarily one that is winning at any point in time. Looking at this map, you might expect that the Oscan or Umbrian languages would have taken over and been the ones to develop forward. But this was not the case because of political reasons. Rome managed to become the preeminent leading state of Italy and the Italians. The Oscans particularly contested this in a war which they lost, and because the Romans won, they kept their place as the politically dominant city of Italy and the leading partner in a further development that we will get to a bit later. Another comment. Oh, those first two are going to be interesting for sure. I imagine these are going to be High German and Spanish. I hope so. I think they are both quite interesting, both on their own and as a comparison with English and French as the first Germanic and Romance language. Spanish is quite interesting because of the massive amounts of diphthongization that has occurred in it, as well as the complete breakdown of the affricates from later Romance. But we'll get back to that later. And High German is stands alone within the Germanic languages with a number of developments that are unique to it and differentiate High German from every other kind of German. So, finally, getting into actual classical Latin. This is where we have let's say, final stage of development for the voiced aspirated stops. We go from B to B to F. This is a simple development, just devoicing it. But in the case of Th to F, the area of articulation moves a little bit forward. The is produced with the teeth and the alveolar ridge, the knob behind the teeth, whereas F is produced with the lips and the teeth. So this is kind of one step forward in the mouth. The G becomes H, which becomes H. This moves back in the mouth a little bit. So you have one that stays the same, but becomes devoiced, one that moves forward and becomes devoiced, one that moves backwards and becomes devoiced, and then the H just jumps to the forward, to the front of the mouth. Probably because this was most likely also a difficult sound to produce for people in those times as well. I don't think this has survived in really any language. Comment, you have a wonderfully written F. I love seeing handwriting. Thank you. I enjoy handwriting. Speaking of, you might notice two different kinds of Fs. There's the word final word final one with more of an angled crossbar, and then you have the word initial with a horizontal crossbar. These kinds of differences in cursive lettering are quite common in almost every language. You even have these kind of differences in the print letters in Arabic, because Arabic does not actually have print letters. Printed Arabic is just the standardized cursive Arabic. And then the second very diagnostic change in Latin is the loss of word initial aspirants. So when we skip forward a little bit, goose has become Hans in early Latin, but in classical Latin it becomes Anser. Sand goes from arena into arena. You probably know arena as the word for a gladiator arena, which of course had sand at the bottom of it, which is why it was called the sand in Latin. Here we have some examples of these words. For the word initial case, when these sounds occurred in the middle of a word, they ended up with a different reflex, so they developed into a different sound. But unfortunately, I couldn't remember these offhand, and looking up words that have certain letters in the middle of them is a lot more difficult than looking up ones with a certain letter at the beginning. Another comment. Same for mine. My first letter F for word tends to be more elaborate than mid-word. And then there's the older German S that also looks kind of like an F. Yes, that is the case. The old German S, the medial S and the F are almost identical. Actually, I'll doodle here a bit. The old S is like this, and the old F is like this. So let's have a vowel here. The old long S is called a long S because it is extremely long. It goes. It is the size of a capital G, for example. This was present in the fraktur, so the kind of blocky Gothic script. I don't think I've seen it in any modern typefaces. This is also, if you speak German, you might have run into a letter that looks like this. Or you might, if you're lazy, you might just write it like a Greek beta. This is an S, Z. So it is simply built from a long S and a Z. And this is called sharpest Z in German, so a sharp Z, Z. Or a sharpest S. One of those, sharp S or sharp Z. And in modern German, this basically means that the previous vowel is a long vowel, because German, while it might have a better spelling than English, also has not really had spelling reform in centuries, which is often the case, as we will get into later today. This is also the case for French. 3 comments on sharpest S. Thank you. I wasn't looking, I was drawing, so I had to remember it myself. Thank you anyway. But finally getting to the example words. We have Breter, so brother. Here we have a B. This becomes an F, so frater. This, you might have heard this in other languages as well. Particularly in Catholic contexts as monks, for example, would be called frater something. Another for de, you have dex, sacred place, becomes fanum, a shrine in Latin. This sounds extremely similar to deus, a god in Latin, but god is derived from the same stem, so they are connected, but God in Proto-Indo-European did not have de, it had de, deus. Our old friend the goose, gens, becomes Hans, becomes answer. And then the most difficult one, quail. Close enough, quail. Meant to stumble. This becomes fallere in Latin, which means to mistake or to trick, to make a mistake or to trick someone. So depending on if you are mistaking yourself, if you are tricking someone else. This is what leads into the word fallible in English. But the word to fall, which sounds extremely similar and has an extremely similar meaning in English, actually comes from the Proto-Indo-European Pol, which becomes fallana in Proto-Germanic, and then fallan, fall, in English. This is one of those cases where the meaning of this word has not changed practically at all in the last 5,000 years, although the phonological, the sounds of this word have changed quite a lot. Then, this is where it gets difficult, because we get into the social war, which was the war between the Latins and the Oscans, particularly. Even this took place 100 BC, about. Prior to this, Rome had already become the leading city of the Italians, and practically all of the Italians were Roman allies. But as Roman allies, they had some rights in the Roman system, but not full rights. So Roman citizens were more valuable, they had more rights than other Italians, even though other Italians were still more valued than, for example, Celts. Many of the Italians found this unfair, as they were, not only had they been loyal Roman allies for a couple of 100 years by now, but they were also Italians, so they had a very similar language and a very similar culture to the Romans, and they disagreed with being held as second-class citizens, And so the social war began. Social comes from soci, which was the Latin word used for these allies, so it's an ally war. The Romans ended up winning this war, but in a move very typical of the Romans, once they had defeated their enemies, they conceded to all their demands. So they beat the Oscans and the Umbrians, but then they made all Italians into Roman citizens. Coming from a modern view, this seems sort of nonsensical, but as a show of force to teach everyone not to mess with them, you have to beat the enemy. But then, because they actually were right, you can't admit that they're right because then you show weakness. So you have to show strength by defeating them. And then because they had right, they were right, you could fix these problems after defeating them. This is also a move that the Romans pulled with the Third Servile War, the one with Spartacus, because the Romans dealt with the revolting slaves extremely brutally, but afterwards they stopped mistreating their slaves quite as badly. So, a show of force, but then actually taking steps to address the underlying problem so that the revolt does not happen again. And then in German you have fallen to fall and falle, trap. Yeah, this is entirely correct. You also have fall as in case, both in in the grammatical context and as Gerichtsfall, for example, a court case, or Polizeifall, police case. How exactly conceptually you come from to fall into case, I can almost understand the thinking behind this, but not quite. Unfortunately, this is often the case between me and the German language. There are a lot of German things that I don't quite understand, but I can almost see the reasoning behind this. One of these is the way of counting time, to have another tangent here. So we as Latin speakers, English, people who speak English, we are familiar with the full hour, then we have a quarter past, then there's half past in English, and then a quarter to. Many European languages have a quarter past and a quarter to, but half to. So half 3 would not be 3:30, it would be 2:30. But Northeast and Southwest Germans have a system where the direction is the same the entire way. So you have 3, and you have a quarter 3 means a quarter towards 3. So Viertel 3 means 2:15. Extremely confusing. And then half 3 means 2:30, and then 3/4 3 means a quarter to 3, so 2:45. This is extremely confusing for me, despite having years of experience with this formulation. I just can't understand it. But getting back to the topic, after the social war, all of the Italians were now Roman citizens and were treated officially as equal. I don't imagine this was always quite the case, but officially. And what ended up happening was that the various Italic languages merged to produce a Romance language that had extremely simplified grammar compared to the preceding Italic languages. This is also what has happened with English. English is a merger of North Germanic and West Germanic, so Viking and Anglo-Saxon populations. It seems that when you have close cooperation and living together of groups that have very similar languages but not quite identical. They end up simplifying their languages and dropping the kind of things that are different between these languages and retaining the ones that are the same, and then picking out something simple to fill the gaps where something more complicated but different between these languages existed. This is also an interesting topic for a future episode on contact languages and creoles, because some more adventurous individuals have even described English as a creole language, which makes some other more conservative individuals extremely angry, because creoles are almost by definition something that occurs between unrelated languages, and some might even say that you should not speak about creoles outside of the Caribbean context. Now we come into the late Latin and or early Romance period. The social war was about 100 BC, and the Western Empire lasted until the 400s AD. So there's a 500-year period where these various Italic languages are merging into each other as the practical language of Italy. But they are all the while there are population transfers, people just moving, war veterans being settled in different parts of the empire, and the constant reminder of classical Latin, which continued to be the official written language of the Roman Empire until the very end, and continued to be the written language of some of the successor states of the Western Empire, such as the Kingdom of Italy and the Visigothic kingdoms in Spain. So some of this is where it gets difficult to display the kind of clean branches that the Snapshots for English episode had, because you get both splits and then mergers and aerial contacts. Something was perhaps invented in France, and it might have spread to some areas, but not to others, not really following the kind of branching structure that classical historical linguistics linguists love to draw. Here are a couple of the more familiar ones. The cognomen, so nickname, Caesar, was originally Kaiser. In general, Latin words that are written with RA are usually words that had I in Proto-Indo-European. Where the A comes from has eluded me until now. If anyone has an actual idea, I haven't read it. It might be that we just don't know. This I ended up being monophthongized. So instead of I in one syllable, you have a one sound. In this case, this is A. Not quite A, it is lower in the mouth. A, almost like A. This is almost understandable because A is kind of in the middle of R and E. So if you no longer move your tongue from R, E, you might stop somewhere in the middle and just hold that sound for the entire time, and then you have A. And then we have the palatalization of velar and alveolar stops, so K and T, but only before front vowels. In the case of Latin, this is basically E, A, and this becomes an affricate. So, to go through the example, Florentia is the name of a city, Florence, and it means flowering. In this case, you have the T and then E, which is a vowel very high and front in the mouth. So it is pronounced almost in the same area as T. T. You begin with T, and you begin to merge these into each other. You end up with a palatalized T, and then this turns into ch. So you ts, ti, che, ts. In this case, you end up with Florenza. This is more similar to the modern Italian Firenze. And in the case of the K, you end up with the hushed sibilant variant of this. So instead of ts, you get ch. So Caesar, Caesar. And this is the way these are pronounced in current Italian, and quite similar to current Spanish. But on the way to French, we will leave these far behind. Comment: it's funny how we still say Kaiser, but pronounce Caesar in the modern way. A classical example of borrowing the same word through different languages. The Kaiser in German, for some reason, possibly because of an attempt to sound more classical. This is an ideology that pervades a lot of the Romance spellings. So, for example, modern French writes time as temps. This is an attempt to look more like tempus, the Latin for time. But in medieval French, you had tens. So here the P had disappeared. And the P in temps in modern French is not pronounced. It is there only so that the word would look more like classical Latin. This is not a philosophy that I agree with, but it's quite common. Whereas Caesar is borrowed through French, where it has gone through some further developments along the way. So the next development is the merger of unstressed syllables. So in the case of English, you identify stressed syllables by the fact that you pronounce them with a higher pitch. You keep saying them for a longer time. In the case of Latin, it was mostly the pitch. In modern Italian, it has become pitch and the amount of time. And these are both example words that survive in Italian with their early Romance variants. So, for example, speculum becomes speculum, the u, specu. This is the weakest syllable, and it disappears and merges into the other ones. This has become specchi in modern Italian. It means mirror. And then oculus, again, this u is quite weak, becomes oculus. Occhi in modern Italian means eyes. And then a loss of nasal consonants before sibilant consonants. So consonants where you let the air out through your nose disappear before ones where you... How do I define sibilants in a good way? Without merging them with the other liquids. Well, let's just forget it. If I say it's something like an S, you probably get the idea. So you go from mensa to mesa, and the previous example of anser, you get aser. And the mesa is, of course, the form that survives in modern Romance languages. For example, in Spanish, if you put something on a table, the table is a mesa. And in English, a mesa is a kind of mountain. In this case, it is a loan word from Spanish, as the Spanish would describe these flat-topped mountains as table-like mountains. Here I get a little bit into the grammatical developments in the early Romance period. Not a lot, but a bit. You might know that Latin had fairly complicated grammar with 5 grammatical cases. This was simplified into Romance so that quite a lot of words ended up being pronounced with their accusative, so at something. Vedo flammam, for example, I see a flame. In this case, the flame is in the accusative. This we know that this happened quite early because the earliest Latin loanwords in Basque already exhibit this. This is also the process that leads to the S plural in Spanish. Again, flammas. This is the current plural in Spanish, but in Italian it is flamme. So quite similar to the classical Latin plural. So the taking life, vita, as an example word, you start from vita, take the accusative vitam, but even in early Romance this had become vita. So a nasal vowel, a vowel that you make by letting some of the air out of the nose. This is something that is extremely common in modern French. I do not think any English variants have this, but Portuguese also has some nasal vowels. The simplification of consonant clusters in Latin begins at this stage, but continues further in the future. For example, qui, what, becomes qui in basically all Romance languages, including Italian, including Spanish, including French. But, for example, the word for night, nox, we take the... Actually, this is the genitive. We should have the accusative here to be helpful. Here we are. Noctem. So the M merges into the E. You get the nocte, which eventually loses the nasal vowel. And this breaks up into different forms in the different main branches of the Romance languages. You get noite, which further develops into noir in French, and noche in Spanish. You get notte, which remains as it is in Italian, and you get nopte, which also remains as it is in Romanian, a Balkan Romance language. So then, coming out of this Romance cloud, there are 3 or 4 main branches. Southern Romance is basically Sardinian. This remains extremely similar to classical Latin. It is the modern Romance language most similar to Latin. It retains 4 of the original 5 grammatical cases. It has undergone some phonological developments, but they mostly appear to be substrate effects from the original language of the Sardinians. So you can imagine that early Sardinian in something like 100 AD would be almost identical with the kind of Sardinian that you might hear today. Then we have the 3 main branches here. So Western, we will get to later. Italo-Dalmatian includes the Italian languages south of Tuscany, and historically the Romance languages of the western coast of the Balkan Peninsula, but all of these have disappeared. I think the last Dalmatian Romance speaker died about 100 years ago, so not relevant today. And then the Balkan Romance is basically Romanian, Aromanian, a couple of other closely related languages. And the same as a map. Here the white areas are Western Romance, and this La Spezia Rimini line is the main is where the main isogloss or a couple of main isoglosses within the Romance languages lie. For example, you have, I think we will have some of these, in this slide. Things that are typical of Western Romance are the voicing of intervocalic stops, so stop consonants that have a vowel on both sides of them. All of these stop consonants in both of these words. So saputum is known in Latin, and vita is life. So we have the P in between A and U, so it becomes, and the T between U and U becomes sabudo. And vida. Vida survives in this form in Spanish. Sabudo has developed a little bit further. And then we have the vocalization of word initial sibilants. So words that have an S or something similar at the beginning of it get an extra E at the beginning. So from sperantia for hope, you get the West Romance esperanza, which is very similar to modern Spanish, esperanza. I think it was username Pig that asked about Celtic influence in modern French in a previous episode. French has a wealth of vocabulary that comes from the Celtic languages, so Gaulish, in practice. And perhaps some grammar. For example, the double negative in French, n'est pas, might be something that they learned from or retained from a Celtic substrat language. But if you want to talk about phonological developments that might have their origin in the Celtic languages, it's basically the levels of Western Romance and Gallo-Romance that come into question as to what which ones could be Celtic influence. For example, this extra E might very well be Celtic influence, as it appears in the entire area where Celtic languages were spoken before Romance, and in some places outside, but that might just be internal migration and aerial effects. And then the thing that, so this does not happen in south of the La Spezia Rimini line, and the loss of geminid consonants doesn't happen south of that either. Geminid consonants are long consonants. In the case of stop consonants, like in this case, you just tense the consonant for a while before releasing it. So mittere, not mittere, mittere. This appears to have also been something quite difficult for perhaps the Celtic population of the Western Empire, and these geminid consonants have disappeared in all Western Romance languages. So you get metere or miter, I think, in modern Spanish. Also, cat, for example, is gatto in Italian, but gatto in Spanish, and chat, historically chatto in French. Then moving forward with the three of the Gallo-Romance languages, in the Western group you have the Ibero-Romance languages, so Spanish, Portuguese. The Gallo, clearly, are the Langs, Doil and Ok. And then you have two branches that might be divergent Gallo-Romance, or they might count as their own main branch. This is not quite clear. I have included all of them in my tree and map. So we have here the Langs Doil. This is what contains French, and the Langs Doc, including Catalan within the Kingdom of Spain, are clearly more closely related to each other. And then the Gallo-Italic languages, such as Lombard, and the Rheto-Romance languages, I think containing Romanche, have some apparently meaningful similarities with the other Gallo-Romance languages, but in other ways stand apart from them. You might notice this empty area here for Venice. This is because Venetian in particular is very much of an edge case. It has some very Gallo-Italic features, which is no surprise because Venice is here at the mouth of the Po River, and the valley of the Po River is overwhelmingly Gallo-Italic. But it also has some very strong Italo-Dalmatian features, possibly because the city of Venice used to rule the Dalmatian coast in the Middle Ages, and as a major trading city, of course, had the population had strong contacts with actual Italian Italy. And the kind of developments that have happened in Gallo-Romance, the first of these, the delineation of voiced stops, is something that has also happened in or spread to Spanish. So known in modern Spanish is saludo, exactly as in early Gallo-Romance. But something that did not happen in Spanish is the loss of word final vowels, which leads to the final and the last and second to last syllables merging into each other. So at this stage, it becomes saúd. This is getting towards the distinct sound of French. This is, for example, also something that survives in Occitan. To the extent that Occitan still survives, it has been almost eliminated in France. So most of the Occitan speakers today are actually Catalan speakers. And then we get the reduction of unstressed vowels. Reduction is a process where vowels become less distinct in some way. In this case, the area where the vowel is pronounced moves towards the middle of the mouth. So instead of A, you have in the middle. Saúd. And a diphthongization around nasal vowels, nasal consonants. So long single sounds in Latin, like rem. This is the accusative of res, thing. You might have heard this in the context of res publica, the common thing, which is where we get the republic from. And this becomes rem in Western Romance and then rien in Gallo-Romance. This is starting to sound almost like French, but not quite. The next main group are the langues d'oïl. Now this is the group that contains actual French, spoken originally in Ile-de-France, but also Norman, Walloon, I think Arabitan as well. I'm not sure about Arabitan. And in these languages, these are named because their word for yes is derived from hoc ille, so o-i, oil, in modern French, oui. It was actually Dante Alighieri, the late medieval poet, who wrote the Divine Comedy, which I'm sure you are familiar with. La Divina Commedia, or Inferno, is the most famous part of it, who grouped the Romance languages of his day into three main groups. These were the langue d'oïl, then the langue d'oc, where the word for yes is derived from just hoc, and the langue des sea, where it is derived from seek. So this would be Italian and Spanish. This kind of divergence happened because classical Latin did not have an actual word for yes. If you asked a Roman something, let's say, is your name Marcus? He would answer, it is, instead of saying yes. However, this phrasing disappeared at some point, and a word for yes developed separately in different parts of the former Roman Empire. Then a development that is quite crucial for modern French is the fronting of R in stressed open syllables. Open syllable means that there is not a consonant at the end of it, and stressed means that it is stressed. The fronting means that an R, this sound is made with the tongue quite far back in the mouth, low and back. It moves forward, so that is low and forward, becomes from R into A. And A becomes an allophone of R. This means that although these sounds are quite different, the speakers treat them as the same sounds, and in some cases they might not even realize that these are actually different sounds. A classical example of allophones in English are the aspirated and unaspirated stops. So for example, you have a pin, this is aspirated, pin, as in something that you stick into a pincushion. But if you rotate something, you spin it without the aspiration. And these two sounds occur in different contexts. So for example, in this consonant cluster that begins with a sibilant, you never have an aspirated stop in English. And on the opposite side, you always have an aspirated stop if it is at the beginning of a word. You as English speakers may ask yourself now if this is something you have noticed or have not noticed. Another example of this same allophone of R and A is in Russian, where the word for 5, which is written p'yat, is actually pronounced p'yat, because in Russian an R that is between two palatalized consonants becomes an A allophonically. But there may be a huge amount of Russians who have not actually realized that these are a different sound. Why this is important is because early French, or an early langue d'oïl, has gone through a second palatalization. So this was the same process that turned Kaiser into Caesar. It happens again, but because now A has an allophone, a front allophone A, the palatalization affects A, and it spreads into R because it is an allophone of the A. So you starting here with Latin, you start with casa, house, becomes casa, and then chasa. This is simple. In the case of bucca, this is a case where the fronting does not happen, and instead the palatalization happens because of the allophone. So you go from bucca to boca. Again, this is the same as in Spanish, but this becomes bocha, something quite unusual and only possible because of the allophone. And I have a third example here, Castellum. So castle in late Latin becomes castel in Gallo-Romance, and chastel in langue d'oïl. This turns into chateau in modern French. Casa becomes the cha, the a has become an e, so this becomes che. This is actually written like this. And this is written like this. How bouche is written, I am not quite sure. It might be like this. I speak some French, but not fluently. Then getting further in the langues d'oïl, we have loss of phonemic vowel length. So here life still has a long E, vida. This disappears and it becomes vida. This is also something that has happened in Spanish. But it appears to have happened in Spanish either at a different time or it has spread into Spanish. Another one is word final devoicing. So South becomes South. Somewhat more difficult for me to pronounce, as you have to move from a voiced into an unvoiced consonant. I might have skipped something here, as I have already written this the old R as a neutral yes, that was already in Gallo-Romance. Never mind. So you have South, and then the dental fricatives around rounded vowels. So vowels where your lips are pursed, like oo. The lips become rounded with this. So we lose the v as well. So this becomes south. This is getting quite close to modern French. And then finally we get to French, not quite modern yet, but French. This is another one of those cases where the region of Ile-de-France became politically dominant and managed to assimilate, in this case actually mostly eliminate the Occitan language, the other oil and all of the Occitan languages in France. Unfortunately, in this case they did not merge as happened with the Latin and Romance, but instead the French state had a systematic program of shaming and beating children if they spoke Occitan at school, and this is a method that works. If you want to eliminate a minority language, shaming the children for speaking it is extremely successful. This has also been used against the Sami languages in Scandinavia and many of the native languages in Northern America. Then early French. We have another fronting, this time of oo. So oo, high and back in the mouth, moves forward in the mouth, now high and front. South. Then the rest of the dental fricatives are lost. We go from via to via, and from south to sau. And then unstressed vowels disappear and syllables merge, so we get vi and su. This is the way that these words are pronounced in modern French. But here you can see how little of the original, well, in the way that Latin can be said to be the original form, how little of the Latin form survives in some French words. From vitam, really only the first syllable survives as such, and it has lost the length of the syllable. And from saputum, a consonant of the first and a vowel of the second syllable survive. So here the loss of sound has been huge. Comment, that's awful. I assume this is in reference to the assimilationary politics. I agree. This is both immoral as a way to treat children, and of course I, as a person who loves languages, would like to have as many as possible instead of eliminating them. Occitan was actually the largest language group of France around the Napoleonic Wars, and it might have still been the majority group, or at least the plurality group, around the First World War. The assimilationary politic really kicked into gear after the First World War. At some point of the population of France, about 50% were Occitan speaking, 40% were Oil speaking, not all of them French as such, and the remaining 10% non-Romance minorities. So Basque and Breton, which are P-Celtic, so closely related to Cornish and Welsh, and of course the Germans in eastern France. Going further with relatively old French, there is a loss of the stops, the stop components in affricates. So from cantare, we have chanter, to sing, and here the T at the beginning disappears, so you end up with chate. But you might notice that the way that chate is spelled in modern French is quite similar to the oil, langue d'oil form of it, and this is the same as in English. That the way that modern French is spelled, if you read out modern French as if it were Spanish, then you usually end up speaking like a medieval. You end up with something that approximates medieval French. It's also the case with all the silent letters in English. If you just read English the way it is written, you end up with an approximation of medieval English. Like, for example, the classical examples: knife. Knife is spelled knife because it used to be pronounced knife. And night is written knicht because it used to be pronounced knicht. This was still the case around 1300 AD. So if you read Geoffrey Chaucer, you should pronounce all of the sounds. And that is what medieval English sounded like. And then, as is the case often with the history of French, there is another round of the process. So a second nasalization. This is the same process that already happened with the in late Latin or early Romance. This word is a case where it did not occur. I think because the A here was long, but I'm not quite sure. In Gallo-Romance, this has become turned from rem to rien, and in Old French, this becomes rien. This is almost modern French. You might notice that I distinctly pronounce the r the same way as in Italian. That is because at this point in time, French still had the hard R. The modern French for this is rien. So between Old French and modern French, the Uvular R has appeared and developed. Then getting into really modern French, so post-medieval, things that have happened in, say, the last 500 years. We have a loss of word final consonants when isolated. So, reading out nous, there should be an S at the end, but there is not. However, the S reappears or survives, depending on how we want to look at it, in the case when you have vowels after one another. So just oui is nous voyons, we go, I think. I should have written the translations for these. In this case, the nous, the z does not appear. But when you have nous avons, the z does appear. This is conceptually difficult for me. I don't understand how this can happen, how the people retain the instinct to add a sound in some context, but not others. However, this is not something that is unique to French. This appears to have also been the case in Sumerian. It seems that the Sumerian genitive, so whose, mine, marker was ak, but the k only survived in liaison situations like this. So you would have Lugal Urima as the king of Ur in the absolutive case, and for example, the king of Ur came, if you would say the king of Ur built a wall, then you would say Lugal Urimake, where the E is the marker for the ergative, and the K appears to only survive through liaison. After that, we have another repetition, a second loss of initial aspirants. This is something that also happened in early Latin. So, of course, Latin words had not had any H's at the beginning in almost 2,000 years, but there were loan words that did. These both examples are German. So instead of saying lesal with the h, leshal or leshalt, you say leal and lealt. And interestingly, for you, these do not liaise. So you do not say lesal or lesalt. And this is because phonological processes have a time period where they are active. So they appear, they stay active for a while, and any new words that are, any old words that were in the language at that point, and any that appear or are loaned, for example, during the time when it is active, also get changed. But any words that enter the language after that do not get retroactively changed. So you did have hal and halt as German loanwords in French with an H at the beginning, despite losing all the H's at the beginning in Latin much earlier. And then my final point here is the Uvular R. This is the R, very typical of French. It has also spread into many of the neighboring languages. You will be able to find some areas in Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Italy, but I think not in Spain, where this has spread. In some areas, all speakers might use it. In some areas, the highly educated might use it. In this case, it is an affectation of the more high-status individuals, traditionally making an effort to speak more like the French, as the French had a very high prestige position in continental Europe for centuries. So this is the step that turns rien into rien. And now, after 1 hour and 20 minutes, so not quite as late as I imagined, we have come to the end. So, if you have comments or questions, please write them now. I will begin to look at Twitch to find if someone that I know is currently streaming. So there do not appear to be any questions or comments, and it appears that the only person on my follow list who is currently online is Kongo Kokuretsu. So, thank you for coming. La missa è finita. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. And let's move on to listening to Kongo Kokuretsu's karaoke in a few minutes.